us bread, but give us roses, bread and roses, roses, bread and roses.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to And Roses, show about the intersections of creativity and social change. My name is Jordan, and I'm joined today by Nora Meek, who is an LA-based storyboard artist and writer who has worked on shows such as The Patrick Star Show, Animaniacs, Mau Mau, Heroes of Pure Heart, Disenchantment, and more. Nora is also a member of the Animation Guild, IATSE Local 839, where she's involved with the crew, that's capital C, capital R, capital E, capital W, Reform Caucus, which we'll talk about. Today we're going to talk about Nora's journey from being an artist with a dream, to being a union activist with a cause. And we're going to talk about what the hell is going on in animation and in Hollywood and why you should care. So how are you doing today, Nora?
I'm good. How are you?
Can't complain here on a beautiful, warm, sunny day recording And Roses with a person who embodies the ethos of the show, somebody who is, creative, an artist, and also involved in fighting for social change.
So sweet.
I try.
So kind.
I want to start by talking about Hollywood and what's going on in the industry. I think what we're going to talk about, some labor negotiations, a potential strike. And I think some people who are not working in the industry might be hearing this and thinking wait, I thought, we just heard about, we had a bunch of big strikes last year, didn't we? We heard about workers organizing. We heard that they won, but now we're also hearing that it's things are still pretty bad. Workers got a lot that they were organizing for, but things are still really slow. People are still having a hard time finding work. Yeah, what's going on, Nora?
Yeah. It's tough in the motion picture sector and in entertainment in general, right? Think any kind of content, and then video games, everything else. It's really tough. Studios are shrinking, production companies are conglomerating. The company I just most recently worked for, Paramount, which owns Nickelodeon, just announced a merger with Skydance, and for $8 billion, spending all of that on just consolidating the amount of options that are available to the public. So there's very little work going on right now. Eliminating all of this content and the need to make it means that they don't make it. And so, where other sectors in IATSE, like live events and, theater, are doing a little better, motion picture is really kind of suffering right now, as well as, and that includes animation too. I think animation is usually sort of last one in, first one out when it comes to consideration, right? Our budgets are often half of what it takes to make a live action show, and we're not paid as well, and we're considered kind of last. So we've also kind of been experiencing that squeeze even before the strike started, though, as well.
Yeah. Can you share sort of a overview of, for people who aren't working in the industry? Yeah, you hear about there's the writers are on strike, or the actors are on strike. And then people maybe have also heard about IATSE, which, represents so many different people. Yeah, how do all of these, sort of unions work together, and who does IATSE represent?
Yeah, I mean, unions, it's so great that Hollywood is such a unionized place because, I mean, it comes naturally because kind of the content mill of making movies has become almost like a factory in a way. So we've got a lot of what we would call craft-based unions. So the WGA and SAG-AFTRA are unions that cover a specific type of worker, which is writers and actors. And IATSE is this interesting blend of a bigger union that covers a lot of different types of workers. That is, we are kind of sectored out into these different kind of sectors. So we've got, people who work in theater and stagecraft and live events, and even to like movie workers, like movie ushers and ticket takers and projectionists. We cover all those people, but our biggest sector is like motion picture workers, the crew that creates the stuff that the writers and actors touch. And we're segmented into these different crafts. So for on-set workers, you've got like boom mic operators and like camera operators and directors of photography, art directors, and then, off sets, you have people like us who are animation workers. But broadly, we're all kind of like segmented into these little locals that like cover the kind of work that we do. And we call those like crafts. So we think of unions as fighting for better working lives with better working conditions. But also sometimes unions are kind of put in this place where they're fighting to be able to work at all. The WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes, they took place because unions and their members like saw how urgent and prescient the need was to make sure that their careers stayed careers and didn't disappear entirely or become gig-based or, get swept up and eaten by robots. And workers right now are fighting this sort of uphill battle against conglomeration, not only of like entertainment, but like all media, including like even tech. So despite, the success of these strikes in these very craft-based areas, there are so many different areas of work where workers are being squeezed for like every last cent. And in order to keep up the gains that the WGA and SAG-AFTRA got, other workers in all these different kinds of sectors are going to have to follow suit. It can't just be the WGA and SAG-AFTRA that are kind of like dragging everybody across the finish line. It has to be also the crews and what are called in the industry below the line workers. So people who aren't deemed to be like high up creatives or in front of the camera, but are more behind the camera in some ways. It's a fuzzy distinction to make, but it's sort of an industry term. But we're gonna have to start fighting as well.
So the writers and the actors, they did one of the most dramatic things possible for an organized group of workers to do last year. They went on strike for a pretty substantial amount of time. And so now what's happening for those not in the know, IATSE is also in negotiations with the same producers that the writers and actors had to negotiate with. Yeah, what is the situation in these negotiations right now? Is it a similar kind of like tooth and nail fight for survival that may lead to the crew members going on strike? How is the negotiations going?
It's hard to know as a rank and file member, and as especially as an Animation Guild member, because we aren't privy as much to the goings on of those negotiations as maybe a lot of us would like to be. But broadly, we've seen kind of like the work of SAG-AFTRA and WGA function very well. Like in terms of what it will possibly get IATSE members, for very little effort on the part of IATSE members, the studios do not want us to strike. And they're exhibiting that in ways probably where they're acting a little more amicably than they did with the WGA and SAG-AFTRA, but also in other ways where they are withholding a lot of work. And that is not only because they are conglomerating, right? Like they're trying to have to make less content and when they make content, they want to make it for less money. They want to make it overseas. They want to make it with non-unionized workers that they can pay less. So they are putting the squeeze on us in those other ways, right? So
can they just do that? Can they just go to non-unionized workers? What's stopping them from doing that if it's cheaper for them?
What's stopping them from doing that now? We see it happen quite a bit, right? I think there are a couple of like European countries that have like very you can produce live action film quite cheaply there. And we have seen some like production go over there. But, broadly, I think what's keeping them from doing that entirely and moving that entire industry over there is the same exact thing that kept folks or the studios from moving production to during the WGA strikes, writing and acting elsewhere, right? It's that like this kind of content and this kind of quality, there's a certain like bar that the studios can't race to the bottom to or go very far underneath before they're not making enough quality content that will get them like the money and income that they so desperately want in order to keep up with these CEO paychecks, right? So I think what's stopping them is also workers, right? Any sort of time where, especially in the States when folks are working on a non-union production, they can go union at any time, and that's like up to them, right? That is like a way that workers are taking back kind of control of the industry. We are seeing it in VFX, especially right now, in IATSE too, and even in games. There's an upsurge in unionizing to push back against this like race to the bottom to make content cheaper and of lower quality or of the lowest quality that a customer might accept. That's sort of like the way that workers are keeping everything afloat, is by
if you have they're obviously it is cheaper to go to other places, but the quality is here in the USA, in America. There's a tradition of craft that's been passed down. But for workers who are in this union, like, yes, you already have a union already, and you are downhill of these wins from the writers and the actors, and the studios don't want another strike. But so what is it what is the fight this time around kind of like centered around? What are some of the things you're fighting for, and why is it that those things aren't necessarily a given?
Well, and IATSE, motion picture workers suffer, I think, a particularly heinous fate. They are being worked to the bone, and they have been for a very, very long time. It's become this sort of like expectation on movie sets of like 14-hour days that will go further and further into like, shoots will end at 2 a.m., 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and shows that are shot with no breaks or weekends. So folks who are working on like 80 days at a time with absolutely no Saturday or Sunday. And these are kind of like conditions that are almost like a given a lot of the time, especially on American productions. And that is like the main sort of like fight of, I think, a lot of motion picture workers, is an end to these insanely long days on set that often cause like just the worst kind of accidents, right? Like Spike Sario from Local 728 died on a Marvel set, falling from this like wooden catwalk that the studio didn't maintain. And Rico Priam recently died as a result of a car accident while driving home after a 14-hour overnight shift. And IATSE members are surrounded by death. They go to a movie set, every day in these like far out locations, trying to make wages to pay bills that are stacking up because, and thanks to all these, companies withholding work. And they accept these conditions wherein they could just die or be severely injured and disabled on set at almost any time because of this like sort of race to the bottom. So that is, I think, the main fight of IATSE workers right now. And that's sort of what they're expressing. And then as well, like sort of it's the same kind of fight that's linked with WGA and SAG-AFTRA, which is like the fight for retaining careers at all, where like if folks are replaced, if actors are replaced by AI, artificial intelligence, or any kind of generative technology, if artists or writers are replaced, then so are these crew workers. If there are no sets, there are no on-set workers. And so that is also sort of the existential fight, right? And that crosses over into animation work, where we are not surrounded as much with like the threat of death or things, falling on us or killing us or these sorts of things. But we are faced with the potential death of our entire art form and livelihood.
Well, so negotiations are ongoing at the moment. What is the timeline here? When are we gonna know if it was is it a win for workers or a loss for workers?
We'll know soon. I folks have been kind of expressing that things are moving along. Basically, all these Hollywood unions come together to negotiate the Hollywood Basic Agreement, and then they get some time to negotiate their own sort of terms that are based on their own crafts. Like the editors have to do editor specific stuff. The set medics and grips have to do specific to them, and then they all come together to work on overall wages and working conditions and protections and that kind of a thing. And then the area standards agreement negotiations take place, which is everyone else outside of Hollywood. So those are folks working anywhere from like New Mexico to Chicago to Atlanta to New York on all these different kinds of film sets. They're very impacted by this big contract that they actually weren't able to vote on until 2021 for area standards folks. And where are we at? What are we expecting? A lot of the time, as you know, I'm a rank and file member of IATSE, and I am an animation guild worker, which the animation guild contract isn't negotiated during these negotiations. We negotiate afterwards.
Why is that?
Well, that has a big history behind it. But as that kind of worker, broadly, I don't necessarily know how things are going to go. But man, that's a fun little history. We used to negotiate with the Hollywood unions. The Animation Guild came from radical roots. We came from this union called the Screen Cartoonists Guild. We were originally allied with this union called the Conference of Studio Unions, CSU, and we struck Disney in the 1940s. And then when CSU was striking Warner Brothers, which for labor heads out there, Hollywood's Black Friday, IATSE colluded with the producers and strike broke CSU. So after an unsuccessful strike against Terrytoons, the Screen Cartoonist Guild was sort of like subsumed into IATSE just as CSU was. And we became what we are today. We eventually got the name the Animation Guild after the Motion Picture Screen Cartoonists Guild. Was a little too long. But our troublemaker roots, we kind of remained strong with that, right? In 1982, we struck as the Animation Guild over outsourcing of our work. And IATSE actually, our parent union, rescinded its support for the strike of the then little union. We were very plucky. IATSE members of like sound and editing departments crossed the animation workers' picket lines. And after that, in 1985, we were then summarily removed from the tandem negotiations with the other Hollywood locals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so now IATSE negotiates health and pension benefits for 839 that we traditionally kind of bind ourselves to accepting, but 839 members, when those health and pension benefits are negotiated at the Hollywood Basic level, we don't have a vote in how.
I hope you don't mind my saying it's so interesting. Yeah, there is of course like all of this like this history and these stories going back like decades and decades of like why you are in the situation that you are in. And of course that's everyone. We didn't fall out of a coconut tree. But, as a member who's in this union and you're just trying to figure out how to, fight for, good working conditions and fight for a living, how do you, like, obviously you've become like very well like versed in all of this, but it just does seem like very complicated and very difficult to navigate. Like how do you as a member, a rank and file member, like navigate and find your way in all of this?
I mean, it's It's been a lot. It's at times I felt like a little bit like crazy. Like, am I the only one who like is going through this? And then actually like broadening my like labor community has like really helped. Like, I realized that like a lot of different union members from all different kinds of unions, whether you're talking like a grocery store union worker or a grad student worker or an electrician, all of these folks like go through kind of similar like kind of mazes of of a design that is kind of a symptom of an organization generally. Like, I think any organization that is this old, or organizations that are this old, like, are going to have these like eccentricities to them that are like difficult to navigate and kind of unapproachable sometimes. I think a lot of union members try. I think folks want to be involved. They want to make a change to their working lives and livelihoods. And sometimes it can be a little intimidating because we're using a lot of like very like formal like processes, and it's hard for people to understand like how those things work. And so a lot of my work that I try to do with folks is teaching them like how their unions work and kind of the process of like raising their expectations of like what a union can be, because the way that unions have kind of had to shrink over the terrible Reagan years has created this sort of like very unapproachable system that doesn't really serve union members that well and doesn't really meet workers where they are. And the process of like getting involved in your union and doing things in it, that's what makes the union like do things that do get others involved and that do make powerful changes to your working conditions.
Well, let's talk a little bit about raising expectations, because you're in this situation where we were just talking about like there are reasons to be optimistic about the current negotiations that are happening, and you're in a position where you're not necessarily you don't fully even know what's going on, but you're maybe a little bit hopeful. But at the same time, you are very, very heavily involved in some efforts for reform inside your union. Why is that? If there are negotiations that seem like hopefully they're going well, what is there to reform? Tell me a little bit about CREW, what it stands for first of all, and then what it's all about.
Right, yeah. So CREW is the Caucus of Rank and File Entertainment Workers. It was born out of kind of three desires, I think. One for transparency, one for more involvement, and one that kind of looks at the way that the union works. So it started back in 21. I think folks may remember, a lot of IATSE telegraphing this sort of we might strike, strike authorization vote. And then the TA, the tentative agreement, came down. A lot of IATSE members in motion picture saw that as like a lackluster contract, and the Hollywood locals actually voted it down by majority. But their electoral college system that they operate under, that we at the Animation Guild are no longer subject to because of what happened in the 80s. We negotiate our own contract, but the system kind of chewed up the votes and spat out a yes vote, but it was a majority no vote for the Hollywood unions. And members kind of saw this union use the strongest tool available to it, and then they saw what kind of contract it got them, because the connection between people and their power wasn't made, between our community and the consumers of the content we make and their power. And then also between like politicians and their place in empowering workers, none of that was kind of like made or tapped into. So with transparency, kind of unions work because people do. People work when they understand what's at stake. We hear all the time from IATSE members. They come to our caucus and they say, what's going on? What are we fighting for? We are just a rank and file group of folks who have come together and kind of like seen that there are a lot of like information disparity, right? So members can't be there to fight for what we need if we aren't informed. Members want to know even what our proposals are. The WGA, for instance, made its proposals clear to its members by allowing them to vote on them, to ratify a pattern of demands, is what they call it, before they even went to this table. But at this point in IATSE, the ANPTP knows more about what IATSE is asking for than IATSE members do. And, how is a union member going to talk to their local politician or their community leaders about their contract and what's at stake if they don't know? And it sort of also goes to the involvement aspect. Like, how do unions fight? They fight with people. People get involved because if they know the strategy, and people understand the strategy because they help develop it. IATSE members, in this sort of like period of low work feel kind of like lost, and they're in a contracting industry and haven't been given tools to make IATSE's fight stronger. We haven't been taught that those tools exist. But if we were invited in to strategize on how we want our union to move during these contract talks and given like opportunity for meaningful feedback, then we'd see that participation matters. Right now, we don't see that. So CREW is about sort of raising expectations about the way the union could work.
I mean, this all sounds, it all sounds like, okay, yeah, obviously there should be transparency. Is there some sort of like faction or a competing caucus that is, just saying like, no, we actually don't need all of that? What sort of like opposition are you running into?
Not a lot. I mean, I think broadly union members are on the side of being more well-informed, more well-educated, and more involved, because that is the default for a worker. Unions and any organization that is as large as an international union, by its nature, there are some like bureaucratic aspects that kind of create a disengagement, right? But we can unteach that, and we can create a system that doesn't kind of see that as the default. For a long time before this, and for many unions all over America, this sort of amicable system of bargaining worked. It got us through the 80s, which was a terrible time for workers. But now studios are not just studios, they're corporations. We're fighting against Amazon, who's making content, but also delivering packages. We're fighting against Apple, who I've worked for, making Peanuts cartoons, but like someone else in Maryland is unionizing at an Apple store. Hollywood isn't just in Hollywood now, it's national and it's global. So as these companies are like eating each other, getting bigger, gaining more control, we have realized that this old way of bargaining where we prized labor peace isn't working for us anymore. We're making, billions for entertainment companies that are just like slaughtering our jobs. And somehow we're still supposed to feel lucky if we work for Netflix or Disney. So we know that our current system, just like our electoral college system, doesn't serve Hollywood motion picture workers anymore. And this sort of means of bargaining is now outdated. But there are some folks who, believe in the tradition of sort of an amicable relationship with the studios. And, that's something that we have to kind of like contend with, right? Is like kind of like telling people like, it's possible for your union to do more than just, the same kind of like raises that don't keep up with inflation like every 3 years. It's possible, and it's only possible through your involvement. We kind of have seen, and again, because it works, right? We have taught people that their union is like a vending machine that you put dues into, and then out come like basic protections, or if something goes wrong, it's like kind of an insurance company that comes and fixes your problem. But that's not really what unions should look like. But it's what we've been taught because of all of this sort of like just the government just being a total shithead, just like in the 80s. And I think unions can look more like a community garden where like some people are doing tending, some people are like watering, some people are thinking about like what's going to happen next season, but we're all looking at like the plot of the garden. We're all like working together, communicating with each other, and sometimes our jobs are moving around, but we're all working on it together instead of just kind of like waiting for the same kind of results every single time.
Well, I really appreciate the way that you sort of framed all of that. Sometimes I've heard from some people who are involved with or care about union reform, and I feel like it can be a fine line. It can be quite easy for your frustration with some of leadership to almost veer into just repeating like right wing talking points about like your corrupt union bosses and creating this sort of vilification of leadership, but to just reframe it as emphasizing the desire for the transparency, emphasizing the desire to bring members into the work. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how you see the ideal relationship between rank and file and leadership, because I mean, due to the structure of a union, you do need to have some of that hierarchy. You do need to have some sort of leadership, but in your ideal world, what does a relationship between paid staff and rank and file members look like?
The thing about being a worker is that a union is the fastest way to get you what you need, right? Like everybody sort of wants the same things. They want a say in their workplace. They want protection when something goes wrong, and they want, to be able to have a job that gets them enough money that they can live off of and also have a good health and pension. None of that comes without a union contract. And the beautiful thing about unions is that they put workers on the same legal footing as their bosses. And union negotiating is like what builds the union the most. It's incredibly empowering to be able to be, in the room with your bosses and like have the law and this organization and your people behind you to get what you want and what you need in the workplace. So what unions really should look like is more participation on every single level. We're told that forming a union will solve our problems, but it's actually acting like a union that will solve our problems. We need to be able to gather sort of like-minded people, see what they want, and then do it. That's the ethos of a union, right? So what we need to kind of look at and think about is that our unions shouldn't look like our workspaces. At work, you don't elect your boss and you don't expect to have any say in anything. You don't get to vote on things at work. And that's why unions are great, is because they don't look like our workplaces. But if your union kind of looks work-like or feels work-like, where there is a sort of like people who you don't really get to talk to making decisions at the top, and then you're not really taking a lot of like democratic kind of votes, or you don't feel considered, maybe then your union isn't operating to the like best that it could, right? And that's not anyone's fault. It's really just honestly, again, Reagan. I think that building that space for rank and file members kind of comes from building community, ones that allow people to cross these craft barriers instead of separating, prop makers from the boom operators from the grips, who are all in separate locals and don't get an opportunity to hear each other's issues. It looks like making a union a place where secrecy and confidentiality aren't the norm, because secrecy serves the boss. Transparency and information being readily available, it brings people together. So it looks like building spaces where people could talk to each other, where people can learn from each other, and then also teach each other, right? Because at the end of the day, the person who is the foremost expert of how their union or how their working conditions should change is a worker. And it's not anyone else. It's not the boss. It's not anyone. It's not a fancy lawyer that the union hires either. And it's not the staff. It's the worker. And so a space where the worker's voice is sort of like we reconvince ourselves that we actually matter and that our voices are the expert voices is the way that I think unions are making themselves the most powerful that they could be.
How did you get involved in all of this? Or actually, like even going back a step further, yeah, I have a friend who he recently broke into the industry. He got his first job. He dreamed for his entire life of becoming a illustrator. And that involved, just like passionately, tirelessly working on his craft, improving his skills, trying to network, moving to Los Angeles, and just like knocking at the door before he finally got a job. That's like a very, very difficult thing that a lot of people think like, oh, that sounds cool, but we'll never actually like make it in that way, I guess. But that's something that you've been able to achieve. Yeah. Where did for you kind of the dream of working in animation come from, and what was your sort of like journey to Hollywood like?
Yeah. I mean, that's like such a common experience, right? Is just like a hustling. It's like this hustle grind set culture that's like the other one that you don't see on TikTok, where we're like always constantly just trying to like hone our craft, improve our craft. When it comes to like artists, because like we tie our like worth so much to our creativity, and like those things are inextricable, like
Mm.
so yeah, I mean, I feel like I was pretty standard, like I loved animation all my life, like comics and cartoons, heart and soul. That was my like bread and butter, just like growing up. So that was the dream. And I went to school in New York and moved out. It was basically, I had no idea what a union was, right? So I should have stayed there and unionized, like my friends at Titmouse Los Angeles, shout out, did eventually do. But what I did was I just moved to Los Angeles because a lot of the story was taking place there. I did a lot of freelance, a lot of gig-based stuff. I worked in a warehouse when I came out to LA. Then I
Okay.
tried like working at like this, like I was like, I'll work at this dog rescue place. I realized it was actually like a front for like a dog breeder, and I was like, I would come home,
Oh
I would
my
like
God.
cry, and then I
Oh
would
my
like
God.
boot up my tablet, and then I would work on freelance. I would do
Yeah.
drawings. And this was like the tail end of like when animation was still done in-house at unionized studios. So when I got
Hmm.
my first, I kind of leveraged enough freelance to leverage like an unpaid test to go work as an animator. I,
Mm.
kind of a frame by frame drawing, but on a tablet. I worked in pretty bad working conditions, like ceilings falling down, like this kind
Oh
of
my gosh.
crowded, like they call it a bullpen. I was like sexually harassed at work. I was threatened with like termination if I didn't like speed up production. But I was in a union. My union, I kind of was like invited out to these like, oh, do you want to come to the general membership meeting? I'm going there in my car. You can come with me. Okay, cool. I don't know what that is, but I'm
So
paying
you
dues to
weren't
it.
really like you weren't even really a super like union aware person before all of this. You were kind of just focused on you just had your art that you wanted to do, and then you find yourself in this moment where it just sort of is like, oh, I guess this is part of the experience. This union is. Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to
No,
verify
yeah.
that.
Yeah. You've got it. It's like I was just kind of dropped into the union. A lot of artists in animation have that same experience where they didn't unionize their shop. A lot of studios in Los Angeles are already union, or they'll come because they like the fact that we have really good talent. They'll come and they'll like sign a union agreement like as they're making the studio, right? For instance, Wild Brain, which I did the Peanuts shorts for, when they opened a branch in Los Angeles, they went union immediately. Like no contest. Like if you're in Los Angeles and you're in animation, a lot of it is union. But their Canadian studio was not union. And those workers had to work really hard to flip their studio, which they just did. Shout out to the
Wow.
Canadian Animation Guild. So yeah, so I didn't have to really work that hard, but realizing sort of these kind of like conditions that I was working in like weren't that great, and like realizing that I could change them with my union was like really cool. My union actually gave me access to like free skills building classes that taught me how to do stories. So I got from animation to storyboarding in 2017, and from there I did writing on and boarding on cartoons. Not only do they treat you better in story, they pay you better. But turning my focus now to these sort of like foot in the door jobs similar to what I had, production workers, for instance, at Nickelodeon were making the same wages as fast food workers, but they were producing SpongeBob, a $13.7 billion property, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was $17.4 billion. Like, and these folks can barely make rent or get groceries. That's sort of like they are now turning to our union and creating that organization within themselves and their structure and joining in with our union, and that being able to see other people do it like firsthand and witness that is like just amazing, like super galvanizing.
So just like for you to have these experiences and then you sort of start, you're in the union, you're seeing kind of the benefits of it, the power, the meaning. But what was it? Was there sort of like a tipping point that convinced you like, oh, actually, like it's good. I'm glad we have a union, but I think it can be better. Like what was that for you?
Animation is very separate from the motion picture on-set locals. So we are a motion picture local, but we are working in offices very siloed away. So I don't work with people who are on live action sets. I don't know what their conditions are like, and why would I have cared? No one told me. But I started doing stuff with the young workers at my local, at the Animation Guild, which connected me with the other young workers committees at these other Hollywood locals. And I started hearing things like, you know, about all these like on-set conditions, like how terrible like the hours were and how long you had to work to even make a decent enough paycheck. And it made me really appreciate like how, you know, well, I had it in a way as an animation artist, you know, not to downplay our own issues, but it made me care a lot about the way that they were suffering, right? I wanted to help out. And so I did. I worked with them a lot. And then, you know, when I tried to sort of get involved at the kind of like national level, right? So the way that kind of like all of our locals come together is like kind of district by district. So we have these kind of like amalgamations of like different states that come together so that we can like do the business of the union. I started kind of seeing the inner workings of like our systems and then realizing like how the more further up kind of like you went nationally, the more and more minuscule like the voice of the worker was able to be. And that kind of manifests in the fact that like I didn't know this as an animation guild worker, but I had no ability to even vote for the president of my union. And neither do any of the other Hollywood workers, right? We don't cast a ballot for it. What happens is you have to be elected as a delegate. You have to go kind of in this sort of like Congress type system to a convention that you can only attend in person. So that leaves out, you know, anyone disabled or immunocompromised can't get on an airplane to travel or can't make arrangements if you're a caretaker to travel. So these delegates are entrusted with the vote for anything at the national level. It's very hard.
Are the delegates elected?
The delegates, yes, are elected, yes. Oftentimes, so delegates are apportioned based on, you know, getting into like the weeds here, but they're apportioned based on...
This is actually what I'm
tribal.
interested. I'm going sicko mode right now too.
Put this on right before you go to sleep. I will lull you to bed. The delegate apportionment is based on the size of the local,
Yeah,
and the charter of the local, and the per capita tax is paid to the national.
Wondering though is like, because I mean, yeah, so it's not, you don't get to directly cast a vote for the president, but there is still, I mean, that is kind of a democratic structure if you're voting on who the delegate is. Isn't that theoretically somebody who is like going to represent the interests of the people that voted for them?
Yeah, the in practice part is the kicker. I mean, it's tough when you're talking about sort of democracy, right? Like, what does that word even really mean, and how, you know, jingoistic are we getting with it, right? Like, when we're talking about a democracy that mirrors the American one, it's not the best, right? We're not modeling ourselves after the best kind of democracy, but that's sort of what we kind of or almost reflect in a way. with our delegate system and with our contract sort of voting system. It's not enough just to sort of, just how it isn't enough to just like sit back and then like vote for a president every 4 years in America. It's not enough just to sort of sit back and vote on a tentative agreement every 3 years. And in the same way that it's very difficult for Americans to get a hold of their representatives, it's also, there is no sort of like system for our members to sort of tell our delegates what they want, and the actual practice of like how that voice manifests itself in delegate votes and delegate sort of movement is hard to see play out in a uniform way. It's not really clear to the average rank and file member how to tell their delegate who they want to vote for president. And so for a lot of unions lately, it makes more sense just to vote on a majority kind of like basis. So the UAW, the United Auto Workers, recently won the right to vote directly for their president. And they voted in, the rank and file voted in a president that was one of the most radical in the UAW's history and led them through these extremely successful stand-up strikes that we did, and a resurgence in sort of unionizing across the U.S. And we see this again and again. Every single union that wins the right to more democracy and to direct democracy, it infuses that union with this sort of passion and fire where the disengagement is gone. They believe that their union, now that they have this direct voice, they believe that they can be in the driver's seat of their union, so they do participate. They come out and they use what the power of the union is, which is people.
Yeah. I think the work that you're doing is very cool. I wish you all the best. I guess what I'm sort of wondering is, I think probably if somebody is like listening to this show, they think already probably like, okay, union's good. But it is just interesting when you really like dial in on, just like some specific craft. Because at a certain level, it's like, you're going to all this, trouble in your organizing, fighting the bosses. But it could feel like, okay, this is just mostly benefit. Like, this is the people who are already have jobs in the industry, who are just trying to like reasonably get better conditions for themselves. But like, how does this benefit society? And I know that it does, but I'm just kind of curious how you see sort of like your role as a union activist as something that's not something that's bigger than just you.
Right. I think that unions absolutely are kind of like the kind of practical way that we are able to leverage the power of just average workers to get benefits not only that are in our working sphere, but all of the things that cross and intersect those spheres. So when we're talking about our working lives, we're not just workers, right? We also have health considerations, health care, educational considerations, and access to education. And work is intersected by race and by sexuality. And work is also intersected by the fight for climate justice and as you kind of widen that lens, work is intersected by prison industrial complex, right? We are pitted against as workers, low wage, workers who are imprisoned right now, working for like below minimum wage and terrible conditions, right? And then in the global sort of like fight for against war and things like that, we touch that, right? As the UAW is, and all these other sort of manufacturers covering weapons manufacturer, right? So as we kind of like expand this idea of what our work kind of like means and what it means to be a worker, we also expand the realization that like we have more power than that. We have more power than just a certain percentage of a wage increase every 3 years, right? We have more power as groups of people, not just unions, to make lasting change. And we don't just see that, play out statistically when, workforces are unionized. We see all across that same workforce, even in non-unionized areas, that those workers benefit. We also see kind of like in the person themselves, in the worker, like acting and being a union, or acting like you are in a union, acting together, acting concertedly, talking to each other until you get a big consensus, and then acting on that consensus. That gives the individual a power that they have been told over and over and over again they don't have by whoever it is, the powers that be, the bosses, the government, whatever. It's sort of this process of doing it practically makes you say, oh, so I do have power. I have this special power. So you, at the end of the day, you don't need a union to act like a union.
For you personally, like going on this journey, starting out as somebody who just you were inspired by the cartoons and shows that you grew up watching. You dreamed of like being able to be involved in that, spending the years kind of like honing your creative craft. But now here you are all these years later, and it's like you're going on podcasts to talk about why people should, organize and form a union. Do you feel like, I mean, yeah, we all sort of, our dreams and our desires can change over the years. Do you feel like, I don't know, your creative energies that maybe you once thought about just like, I want to, I want to make shows, is that kind of like fulfilled through the work that you do organizing now? Or do you feel as though like this work is maybe like more of an obstacle and it's just something that is like a necessity and you wish you had time to just make the shows, but this is unfortunately what you've got to do?
Yeah, I mean, animation is this like special like art form, right? That is so like compare it to comics, compare it to painting or anything else. Animation is this special art form that's like especially industrialized, right? We have almost this like pipeline factory process. And in that way, it's also been corporatized, right? We have our roots in like Disney, which is this huge like conglomerate power now. And I think when people start out in animation, they don't necessarily, or maybe they see that as kind of like a benefit, if I just work hard enough, I'll get my show idea noticed by this big corporation, and they'll put the money forward to make it, because animation is very expensive. It's difficult to make, and it is that pipeline process, and it takes a lot of people to make it. For now, I mean, if robots don't have a say in it, but realizing that and realizing that like you're not just kind of like this like siloed artist. You are this kind of like, you are a worker in every sense of the word, is kind of in a way a little bit of a disillusionment sometimes, but like also like very exciting to see yourself as like included in the labor wave and the labor movement. I like to call creativity like by another name. I call it generative power, because I think that workers inherently have different kinds of power, right? They have like, people power, the power to come together and withhold labor, but they also have generative power, the power to come together and like make things together. And that's where I see like art playing into like sort of the labor aspect of my life, is that I get to see people have a vision and then execute it creatively together. Like at Nickelodeon, we brought people together in a way that was like incredibly more transparent than it ever had been in our union before, as we were negotiating this contract. And we said, what do you think will work to scare the bosses? And they had so many ideas. We did things, labor actions that we had never done before. And seeing people go, well, we have these chalkboards all over Nickelodeon. What if we papered them? What if we drew on them? No, what if we, used sticky notes to just pepper them with all of our demands? And what if we did it? There's this big company corporate event coming up at Nickelodeon. What if we planned it and executed it at that event and sort of forced all of these executives and CEOs to look at our demands as we're negotiating this contract that they are dragging their feet on? And seeing people just add generatively onto this idea feels like working in animation, where you're collaborating with people together on these projects. You're bouncing ideas off of each other just like you are in a writer's room. And that, I think, has been so fulfilling, because not only, you're not doing it anymore for the company, right? You're not writing a funny joke that Patrick says on, a SpongeBob show and then giving it to them to make money off of. You're doing it for yourself, and you're doing it for your colleagues and your coworkers. And that's a more exciting power to realize that you have and instill in other people.
Yeah. Well, okay, I really like that conceptualization of the generative power, but it is the very first thing that it makes me think of is generative AI. And because you mentioned
Yeah.
it's we can do, and but that's not the only thing it makes me think of. I think it is a great concept, but I was kind of already thinking about that a little bit because you had just said, it's animation is extremely labor intensive unless it is something that robots can replace, and it feels like maybe that is something that is a new battle that we're going to see how much we need to contend with over the next few years. We don't know what the future holds and what new fights it's going to hold, but I mean there are certainly challenges on the horizon in addition to the challenges that are already all around us. Are you somebody you feel like it's possible to make the world a more beautiful place while we still struggle our lives against capitalism, or do we just need to do we need to burn it all down and start over?
Oh, that would be beautiful too. You could make art with the ashes. No. Yeah, I mean, there is an aspect of, kind of burning and rebirth that we kind of do every day, kind of as artists and creatives. But is it possible, to make the world a beautiful place? Yeah, I think so. I think I used to tell myself the last time that art mattered was in the 80s, because we were going through sort of the AIDS epidemic, and a lot of of the protest of that era. The protests of the 70s mattered, and the protests of the decades before mattered, but the 80s were the last time I felt sometimes that it mattered, that art had an impact on politics and on society. But I think art still matters, and it's mattering more to people. I think people are realizing the impact that art has in their lives and how much we need it. And I think the pandemic almost triggered that for a lot of people. People looked at their work and the things that they had to do to survive and said this is not me. And we saw this resurgence of not only just new independent businesses and stuff that people were starting on their own, but also people pursuing their dreams and their crafts and their passions more. And that is what kind of got us closest that I think we ever got to a general strike. We called it the Great Resignation, I think it was called, where a lot of people were resigning from their jobs en masse. And it made wages go up. It actually worked for a brief moment, and then, there was the crackdown, right? And that's sort of what we're struggling against. And there's always this push and pull of us discovering our power, using it, and then of course the powers that be and our bosses and these sort of upper class kind of realizing where they can push us down even more. And so I think the beauty is in the struggle a lot of the time, because the energy that comes from the anger, it really is an energy, right? I think realizing and struggling together makes you connect with people that you never would have known that you can connect with, right? I helped organize and build these like protest prop puppets for Unite Here Local 11, which covers a lot of hotel workers in the area while they were doing their 60 plus hotel strike across Los Angeles. And like those boundaries, like we wouldn't have crossed those boundaries unless there was a fight and a struggle for me to like be involved in. So I think like that like is the beauty. The beauty is in like finding ways to help each other in that way.
Yeah, you made me think of two things just now. One, just that, the emptiness of life without sort of like art and beauty, which is, I think about, that they made a bunch of movies in the 90s where it was just sort of like the main theme was just like a guy who had like a super comfortable like life, big house in the suburbs, some cubicle job, and just like hated the monotony of it. And that was like a big thing that there was a lot of cultural commentary about at the time. And yeah, it was just this idea, I think, in this moment of history where like, yeah, people like had everything, and even like aesthetically, like have some art sculptures or whatever, pieces of art on the walls, but just the emptiness of a life that is just a little too like sterile. Yeah, we look back on it now and we're like, are you kidding me? You guys have no idea how good you had it. But yeah, and because the second thing is that it's like that sort of the beauty that brings fulfillment is not just like aesthetic. It's not just content. It's not just like something that is nice and pleasing to, music to your ears or whatever. It is, I think, what's really especially meaningful is things that are forged out of struggle, out of community, out of building something with people. And yeah, and so I think that's, if we want to talk about intersections of, creativity and social change, I mean, I think that's where the fulfillment in life lies, is exactly at that intersection. Okay, also third thing. I do in the framing of that question about can we build beauty under capitalism, or do we need to burn it all down? I would like to clarify, I am a socialist. I do ultimately think that we need to completely reform our economic system in this world. I'm not suggesting that we should just try bringing about some beautiful reforms under capitalism. I just want I want that on the record.
Just so everyone stop writing the Google Doc
Do not
right now.
clip
Stop
that
writing.
other bit. Nora, I loved having you on the show. I'm just curious, is there anything else? So we've covered a lot of subjects, but anything else that we didn't get to that's been on your mind, or anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I mean, yeah, just such a wonderful like conception, right? To think about like art as connected to the struggle kind of for better conditions in life. I think that's so powerful because as artists, we don't see ourselves connected in that way. We see kind of like ourselves apart from the labor movement, first of all, because this isn't the conception is not that like we have like real labor, right? Like it's a labor of love. We do it because we love it, like I don't think that's a right way to look at it anymore. And that's exactly the way that companies want us to look at it. And the powers that be want us to look at it is like, you're doing yourself a favor by being able to create. But really, it is like something that human beings desperately need, and we wouldn't have a society without, and we would be sort of stuck in this sort of sterile loop of, in a very depressing life without. And we have power in recognizing that the value we bring is not like something that we're lucky to be able to be paid to do. It's something that we're extremely underpaid in doing and mistreated in doing, and we shouldn't have to do to survive. But yeah, it's and that's what makes kind of like I guess like that struggle beautiful. And it would be so nice to have a nice utopian society. We'll get there eventually, right?
We're
if we just
working
make
on
like
it.
maybe like 3 more podcast episodes, I think we'll get there. Like
I
we're
think
right
so.
there.
3 more. And my call to action, join the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest socialist organization in the United States and is a group that connects people across all sorts of struggles, from labor to climate to racial justice and immigration justice. That's one thing that people can do, just personally speaking. Nora, you have any
Absolutely.
plugs? Any other competing socialist organizations you want people to join?
Well, no less than 12. No. Yeah, I think it's great. And I saw a little shout out that DSALA did of a little video that even animation workers put together on their social media that they call Animation Workers Ignited. People making art to kind of hype up the struggle, right? Like, so all of these things are so wonderfully connected, and just so happy to be connected on this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated having you. Good luck with negotiations and reform efforts. We're wishing you all the best.
Thank you. Good luck, not getting canceled. I'm so sorry.
They're coming for me. The pitchforks are already coming out. All right, take care, Nora.